Hello everyone, this is the second part of our lecture number 20 for History 231, Ancient Mediterranean World. This is Diocletian, Constantine, and the Rise of Christianity. And we left off last time with our friend Diocletian trying to put the Roman Empire back together after this extremely long period of 50 years of crisis and problems, the famous crisis of the 3rd century, which is a major event or series of events which are going to reshape Rome and ultimately the world itself. And Diocletian, of course, had tried to put things back together, and as people do when they're trying to put things back together, he was willing to try new things. This is when you get creative. When you're in a crisis, you get creative how to resolve the crisis. And this is something that he tries to do. So what he tries to do is he says, okay, we need to have co-emperors, we need to have junior emperors. He has all these clever plans to try and make this work, and it worked for a while. But ultimately, no, it didn't. Here's the problem. The guys who he puts in and who are put in to be emperors and co-emperors are ambitious political types. And we see these kind of people throughout history, right? Men and women who get power, and they like power. They like having authority and power. It's what moves them to action and this kind of thing. Now, personally, I don't want power because, quite frankly, power means responsibility, and responsibility means work, and, well, let's face it, I am just enough like our good friend Homer Simpson here that I don't want to have all that extra work. I kind of like to be able to just sort of go like our friend Homer does. I'm going to let him go back over here and take a nap. So, this is an interesting sort of thing. Diocletian tries. He tries. But after he abdicates, because he says, well, I can't go any higher. He started life as a slave or the son of a slave, and he wound up being emperor, so can't get any better. He retires, and he's gone. He's out of the picture. And pretty soon, the guys who have this power are fighting each other again. And Rome goes through another period of basically civil war. More fighting and more conflict as various guys try to become the next emperor, the next big guy. Well, this goes on for a while, and the fellow who emerges from all this conflict is a major figure in world history. He gets 2 stars. He actually shares 2 stars, as you see from your PDF. This is our friend Constantine, and Constantine is a game changer. He's going to really change human history, all right? And he does it in a very interesting way. Well, he gains power by knocking off his last rival at a place called the Battle of Milvian Bridge. The Battle of Milvian Bridge, and here's what happens. After the battle, he wins the battle, and yay hooray hurrah for him. He wins the battle, gets rid of his rival, becomes eventually the emperor of all of Rome, and then he says, hey, I won that battle at Milvian Bridge because I had some help. Here's what happened, he said. Before the battle, I had a vision. I had a vision that a god appeared to me and said, with this sign you will conquer. In other words, if you put this sign on your soldiers' shields and you wave this sign around, I'll help you and you'll win. Well, he won, and so presumably it worked. That's certainly a way he could interpret it. That seems to be the way he did interpret it. And this is a very interesting thing, because exactly what this symbol was, we're not entirely sure. There's 2 possibilities. All right, but they are both symbols of this really obscure little religious group that most Romans had, well, heard about but didn't know much about. They were these really obscure, strange people that the Romans were like, what are these? Who are these people? These people were very much under the radar most of the time, unless, of course, they were being persecuted. And these are the Christians. All right, these are the Christians. And the Christians are going to be a game changer. They're going to change everything. All right, they're going to change world history. And so this is going to be a very big deal. So Constantine says, okay, I won the battle, and so I'm going to start saying, hey, you know what? We've been persecuting these Christians. Some of the worst persecutions of Christians ever, he had probably taken part in himself. We're not sure, but he might have. And they had been done under Diocletian, because Diocletian's trying to pull things together, remember? And he doesn't want anyone dissenting from his plans. And these Christians, they do something that the Romans just can't tolerate. They have this one thing they refuse to do that the Romans say you got to do, and that is worship the emperor. The imperial cult had been building for centuries, and was the idea that you worship the emperor. Now, If you worship the emperor, and you're most Romans, a pagan Roman, the emperor is just one more god of many gods. Lots and lots and lots of gods running around out there. Lots of gods running around there. So what's one more? Who cares? I'll make a little sacrifice to the emperor. I'll get my, piece of paper saying I did it. I can go back to my life. It's no big deal. It's no big deal. Certain groups, however, couldn't do this. The Jews, for example, could not do this because the Jews are monotheists. And the Jews said, we can't do that. We cannot worship any god other than our God, our friend, double star friend, YHWH, Yahweh. All right? So we can't do it. And the Romans are like, okay, we're going to cut you Jewish guys some slack. You don't have to do this, right? But everybody else does. Now, these Christians who have been kind of literally living in the sewers, worshiping in the sewers, all right, to keep under the radar, they are like the Jews in a very important way. They're monotheists. And what they're saying is, we can't do this either. We have to worship only our God and no other God. And the Romans are like, wait a minute, buddy. You're not Jewish. You don't get off on a hook on this. No, you had to do it. You've got to worship the emperor, and that's the end of it. You've got to make that little sacrifice. Now, some did. All right, there's no question. Some people say, like, it's just not worth dying over, because the Romans would take the Christians who refused to do this, and they would do terrible things to them. The Romans were very, very talented at doing terrible things to people, and so they would do this to these Christians. So for most Romans, the Christians are these weirdos who worship one God, and that's kind of weird to the Romans anyway, but okay, fine. But they also live in, they worship in the sewers, they're out of the picture, and they won't worship the emperor. They're just not playing along. They're not playing the game. And so a lot of Romans are like, these guys are weird. They may not know any Christians personally, they might not know much about Christianity, but these Christians are a bunch of weirdos. That's the way the Romans tended to see the Christians at this point. And of course, Diocletian had persecuted them. Okay. Constantine comes along. And Constantine has this vision where the God of the Christians said, hey, I'll help you out, and appears to have done so, at least from Constantine's point of view. And so Constantine's like, we can't persecute these people. Their God helped me out. So he says, we're going to change the rules. We're going to change things. All right? And he issues a really interesting proclamation. It's called the Edict of Milan. And you'll notice the Edict of Milan gets a star. In 313 AD, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan. I'm going to read you a big part of the Edict of Milan because it's a really interesting document. Here's what it says. No one whatsoever should be denied freedom to devote himself either to the cult of the Christians or to such religion as he deems best suited to himself, so that the highest divinity, to whose worship we pay allegiance with free minds, may grant us in all things his wonted favor and benevolence. End quote. Now, I don't know about you, but that's pretty nice. That's actually a statement of religious tolerance. And religious tolerance is, I think, a really good idea, right? It's really a pretty good idea. And so religious tolerance is part of the Edict of Milan. Right? And so what Constantine is doing is he's saying, we're going to stop persecuting the Christians. Okay, well, that's nice. That's a good thing, right? Can't complain about that. But he does something else as well, because this is the thing. Constantine also believed that he had been assisted by the God of the Christians. That God had helped him out, and he wants to return the favor. So he starts not just tolerating the Christians and saying, yeah, sure, guys, you can do what you worship you like, that's all very cool. He starts saying, I'm going to start funneling money into these guys, because he's got another plan. And it's a very interesting plan we're going to discuss in more detail down the road. But his plan seems to have been, maybe I can use this Christianity thing, this religion, this cult, to help further my plan to hold the empire together to prevent a repeat of that nasty crisis we just got through. And that seems to have been one of his goals, was to actually use Christianity as a way of unifying the empire. And so if we're going to understand Constantine's effort to do this, we've got to do something else. And that means we've got to take a little step back in time, and we've got to say, who are these Christians? Where do they come from? What's going on with these Christians? And in order to do this, we have to take a look at Christianity. All right? And that's what I'd like to do now. Now, I want to start with my famous disclaimer. Here's the disclaimer. All right? Always remember what I said the first day of class. Your religious beliefs, whatever they may be, are yours. Nobody, not me, not the state of Connecticut, not anybody, has a right to tell you what to believe about religion. That is your personal choice, all right? And no one gets to tell you what to believe. And I really believe that, and I stand by that. I really do. All right, I stand by that. And if you want to believe nothing, that's also fine. Whatever you believe in this regard is up to you. All right, you get to decide. That being said, what I'd like to do now is talk about the general scholarly consensus, and I say general because there's going to be dissenting disagreements within scholars about some of these things, but the general scholarly consensus about the origins of this religion, Christianity. Where does it come from, who's involved, and what did those people apparently believe? Now keep in mind, we're dealing with ancient history. The number of sources we have for this are not that great, and so we are having to reconstruct a lot of things, and we could conceivably be wrong about some of these things, but this is the consensus. And I don't think it's unreasonable to say, I want you to learn what the consensus is, even if you personally don't happen to agree with it. All right, that's what the approach we're going to take in this class, just as we've taken with all the other religions we've talked about in this class. All right, so that's what we're going to do. So let's proceed. Christianity is based upon this guy named Jesus. Some of you may have heard of him. Okay, that's a terrible joke. Jesus. All right, it's based upon this fellow Jesus. So what we want to do when we talk about Christianity is ask ourselves, who is this guy? All right, who is this guy, and what do we know about him, and how do we know what we know? What are our sources, in other words? Let's be historians here and take a look at what our sources are. So let's do that now. All right, let's do that now. A couple of things. We don't have good dates for this guy. You'd think we would, considering the entire dating system of the Western world is based upon the notion of zero, right? And zero is connected to Christ. This is, of course, a problem because we don't know what year he was born. We do not actually know what year he was born. We have different sources, and what do the sources tell us? Well, let's see. All right, let's see. There is, of course, the census of a guy named Quirinius in 6 A.D. or 6 CE. All right, and this guy, all right, is in 6 AD. So Christ was maybe born, Jesus was maybe born in 6 AD. There's another tradition which connects him to Herod the king, and Herod the king, of course, died in 4 BC. So probably somewhere in that 10-year range or so is when he was born. That's our best guess. That's all we can do without a time machine. So there we are with his beginning, all right? His death is connected to the reign of the Emperor Tiberius in Rome, and that puts it at about between 28 and 30 AD or so. So he lived sometime into his late 20s, maybe about 30 years. That's how long this guy was alive. The next thing, his mother. His mother is a lady named Mary, and she's a very interesting lady. A very interesting lady. His father is a fellow named Joseph, and of course, as we all remember, at Christmas time, we tell the story of Joseph and Mary's pregnant, and all that sort of thing, all right? Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is Joseph, we're told, is descended from the house of King David. Now, what does this mean? This is actually quite important because King David, you'll remember, was the guy that God said, you and your descendants will rule Israel. All right? Now, of course, that didn't last, right? Israel had been conquered and so on and so forth. But the notion of connecting Jesus to David gives him a certain cachet, a certain legitimacy in the minds of some, so that's an important thing, all right? We're told that he was born during the time of Herod, the famous story we hear at Christmas, of course, about his birth and the 3 wise men and all that good stuff. All right? His family fled to Egypt, then came back. We're told he preached and performed miracles, all right? And eventually the Romans executed him. That's the basis, the basic story of this guy. All right? Not a lot. Not a lot of information there. Now there is, of course, more than that. What do we know about him and where do we get our information? That's the next question we as historians want to ask ourselves. All right. Our major sources for this guy are what are called gospel accounts. Now, gospel is Greek for good news. All right. That's what it means in Greek, good news. All right. Now, there are a lot of gospels. There are a lot of gospels. 4 of those gospels, 4. I suck at math. Okay, 4 Gospels are what we call canonical Gospels. Now, canon is an idea that this is the official authoritative text about something. And canons exist all over the place. I mean, I've mentioned several times Star Trek has a canon, the official Star Trek canon of the things that are supposedly correct and real in the Star Trek universe. And then there's all those other things which are not. And this is interesting because, of course, canon extends to all kinds of things. So in Star Trek, it's the official Star Trek universe, and then there's all the fan fiction, which is not official in the Star Trek universe. Well, the same thing actually applies in religious texts, and it applies here as well. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are canonical. They are the beginning, the basis of the beginning of the New Testament, all right? They're the beginning of the New Testament, and they tell us about Jesus, all right? And this is very interesting stuff, all right? But there's also a lot of other Gospels, which are not canonical. They're not in the New Testament. And they tell us a whole lot of things about Jesus too. Who wrote those and what were they thinking? Who wrote the Canonical Gospels and what were they thinking and why? These are questions that scholars have been wrestling with for a long time. There's even a Gospel of Judas, who's the guy who supposedly betrayed the guy, right? So these are very interesting documents, these non-canonical Gospels, and the Canonical Gospels are themselves very interesting. Now, what is a Gospel? That's another question. What is a gospel? Again, the word means good news. Gospels, let's start with what they're not. First of all, they're not histories. Okay? This is not history. Those of you who are history majors who are studying history, and I encourage all of you to study history because it's good for your brain, but if you're talking about history, the Gospels are not history. All right? They're not trying to be history. They don't give us some basic information like, well, his birthday. All right? They don't give us that information. So the Gospels are not traditional histories, all right? They're also not traditional biographies. They are not actually stories of his life. They're stories of his deeds, some of the things he did, but they're not stories of his life. They leave out all sorts of things you would expect to find in a biography and expect to find in a history book here. Now, we are quite certain that they were all written down years after he was dead. All years after his death, they were written down. So these are not contemporaneous. They are not, technically speaking, primary sources. And those of you who are history majors know what a primary source is, a source written at the time of an event. So right now we're in the middle of this coronavirus crisis, and if you're keeping a journal or a diary of it, that's a primary source. If you wait 10 years and you're telling your children about it, that is not a primary source. That becomes a secondary source. All right? So that's something to keep in mind. These are not primary sources. The Gospels are not primary sources. They are secondary sources here. Now, when were they written? Well, of the 4 canonical Gospels, scholars have studied this a lot, and the general consensus among scholars is that they were written between about 65 and 100 AD. Right? Which is not bad. That's not too far from Jesus' time. And it's entirely possible the people who wrote those Gospels had access to and could talk to people who had known Jesus personally. So that's pretty darn good, actually. As ancient historical sources go, that is not a bad thing. And so this is very, very interesting. This is very, very interesting. Other things we can tell about these Gospels, which are quite fascinating, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke clearly had the Gospel of Mark sitting next to them when they wrote their Gospels. They clearly did, because they reproduce, they copy, they crib, one might even say they plagiarize Mark extensively here. And we know this for a number of reasons. For one thing, there's interesting parts, and I had a professor once who talked about, I got to tell you this wonderful story. The professor was talking about how we know this, and he said, well, one day, the guy who's writing one of these later 2 Gospels is sitting here, and he's writing it down, and he's copying word for word from the Gospel of Mark, and then his wife says, dinner time, and he says, okay, comes back and skipped a few words, all right? Something happened and he skipped a couple of words, right? So this is something we can tell by examining these Gospels closely and carefully here, right? Now, of course, Matthew and Luke add material as well. They add other material that is not in the Gospel of Mark, and that's quite fascinating. And some of this comes from what's called the Q source. Now, we would love to have the Q source. It appears to have been another Gospel, an early Gospel, but we don't have the whole Q source. We have the copies of the Q source in our friends Matthew and Luke, all right? And those are about 200, I suck at math, 200 sentences common to this group here. All right, that's not found in the Gospel of Mark. So that's interesting here. Luke, of course, adds all sorts of other good stuff, like material about Jesus' birth here, for example, here. All right? A lot of scholars believe that whoever wrote Luke, the Gospel of Luke, is also responsible for writing the book of Acts, which tells us about what happens after Jesus is crucified and out of the picture. So that is kind of an interesting sort of thing. And then we come to the Gospel of John. Now, the Gospel of John is kind of an outlier. It's on its own. It's separate from the other 3 Gospels, and it starts out with all sorts of interesting philosophical ideas. It starts out with the idea of logos. Logos is Greek for word. Okay, Jesus, according to the Gospel of John, is the Word of God. And words have power. Saying something has very real power. And the Gospel of John focuses on the last years of Jesus' life. All right, usually, again, it's dated to about 100 AD or so. And the other interesting thing about these Gospels is they were written in Greek. Now, Greek was the standard language that most educated folks used in Judea in the 1st century AD. Hebrew has become kind of a language of scholars, and rabbis off in their corner, and the Greek is the language that most people were using for writing things down. Aramaic was the language that they would speak at home if you are Jewish, all right? And so Aramaic, of course, continues to be very important. But it seems pretty likely that the Gospels were written originally in Greek. That makes perfectly good sense. Some people, however, some scholars have argued that no, they were originally in Aramaic, which would have been, again, the language Jesus spoke, and then they were translated into Greek. All right. Even a fellow named St. Jerome from the 5th century, a very, very smart guy. We don't want to underestimate how smart this guy was. He said that as well. So I'm going to leave that open. All right. I'm going to leave that open as to whether they were originally written in Aramaic and translated into Greek, or whether they originally were in Greek. The general consensus is the latter. They were originally written in Greek. So that is an interesting sort of thing. Now, I'm going to stop because I'm running out of time, but the next thing we're going to talk about are the other Gospels, the non-canonical Gospels, the Gospels that are not part of the New Testament. And those can tell us some very interesting things about Jesus as well. So stay tuned for that.